A progressive insurgent challenges an establishment Democrat. Before there was the 2016 presidential race, there was Chicago's race for mayor. On the Laura Flanders show this week, Jesus Chuy Garcia, the man who forced Rahm Emanuel into that city's first runoff. He's our guest, along with Working Families Party National Director Dan Cantor, who believes New York and Chicago are modeling a way forward for progressive Democrats. And later, the author of a new book, Brown is the New White, Steve Phillips, discusses the importance of cultural competence in electoral politics. And a few words from me on pity and mute, the big bad election strategy that is sure to shrink the electorate. Welcome to the Laura Flanders Show, where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. We often talk on this program about how the problems we're facing as a nation, as communities, are structural. They're not solvable with a simple fix. If they're structural, can they still be affected by electoral changes? A lot of people look at an election cycle like the one the United States is going through right now and say, no president can fix what's wrong in my neighborhood. I'm going to sit this one out. In this struggle between those who say get involved and those who say the problems are way bigger than this election, live our next two guests. One is Commissioner Chuy Garcia, who gave Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel the run of his life for re-election last year and forced him into his first ever, the city's first ever mayoral runoff. Chuy, welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Great to join you.
Also with us, Dan Cantor. He is co-founder and director of the Working Families Party, which has made itself a force to be reckoned with in New York and now has its sights set on the national stage. It also had an impact in Chicago, working on the Garcia campaign. Welcome, Dan. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Chicago, Commissioner. Talk about those structural challenges. What are you facing?
Well, Chicago is a city that is struggling to come out of the age of deindustrialization, where massive job losses occurred that really impacted everyone, but especially African Americans and Latinos. Consequently, as the city moves forward, becoming a corporate center, striving to become a global city, you have huge investments in the city center and the central business district, while the neighborhoods suffer, particularly the neighborhoods where African Americans and Latinos live, coupled with a pattern where schools have been disinvested in part due to an antiquated state tax system, lack of investment, over-reliance on property taxes, and then you have a wholesale demolition of the old public housing system that existed there without replacement of that housing. So you really have at play a tale of two cities. So the concentration of poverty that we had before deindustrialization peaked is now replayed out again, because you have people without jobs, concentrated poverty, high levels of violence, and systems that are public systems like the schools, housing that haven't been invested in. So the concentration of poverty has gotten worse. The city has become more violent, and that's how you acquire, the moniker Chirac. Chicago is in further turmoil over the past 3 months, since we've discovered that we have a very serious criminal justice system that isn't fair, that isn't transparent, where police accountability and violence have been very frequent, and the communities are up in arms about it. So there's also a crisis of confidence in the city.
New York's not so different from Chicago in its history. What's the challenge look like where you are, Dan?
The structural rules of the political game in New York are better than they are in Chicago, most prominently around public financing of elections. The whole rise of the progressive caucus in the city council and the election of Bill de Blasio would have been entirely impossible before the arrival of publicly funded elections, because it meant you didn't only have to have a Rolodex full of wealthy contributors. Everybody ran with an adequate amount of money, which you collected in low dollar contributions. So it's one of these rules of the games, one of these structural reforms that seems dry, but is monumentally important. There's an effort underway in Chicago to set up a system similar to New York. If it succeeds, it will transform things. And that's the structural dilemma that really should be on everyone's mind.
How much money did you have to raise to run for mayor last year?
Well, I wound up raising about $5 million directly, but I was up against $30 million plus the elite newspapers, opinion makers in the city, the political establishment, etc. Had Chicago had a small donor system in place, the results would have been different.
Completely.
Had there not been concealment of scandals, cover-ups, etc., the results might have been different too. But more importantly, had we had a small donor system in Chicago, clearly the outcome would have been similar to New York's. We made some important gains. We redefined a multiracial, multi-ethnic, across-faith coalition throughout the city, so that's very promising for Chicago. But because of the influence of big money by the 1%, by financial capital, which just came into Chicago from East Coast and the West Coast and other places, it turned out to be a very difficult barrier to victory.
Give some people a little bit of a sense of your background. I mean, you weren't even planning to run, right? I mean, Karen Lewis from the Teachers Union was going to perhaps make a run against Rahm Emanuel in his re-election.
I'm one of the first Latinos elected to the Chicago City Council when Harold Washington was mayor. Transformational time in the city's politics.
Early 80s.
Then in the 90s, after he passed away, I was elected state senator, the first Mexican-American, first immigrant Mexican-American, be elected to the Illinois Senate. I did 2 terms. I was back at a nonprofit that I founded for 10 years, best job of my life. Then I got elected to Cook County government. I ran to help a progressive get elected, reform that government, which had a bad reputation. I was coasting to a re-election, a 4-year term, without an opponent, first time ever in my life. And then I was thrust by the challenge of the possibility of there not being a progressive with coalition building potential to run against Rahm Emanuel. So when my wife gave me the green light, we said, let's do this, and got on the ballot within 3 weeks, filed more petitions than anyone else. And the rest is historic.
Yes. We were involved, lots of people were involved. Reclaim Chicago, United Working Families, that's our affiliate there. But Chewy's willingness to run was really nothing less than heroic, and it helped drive turnout for some of the down ballot races. So the Progressive Caucus on the Chicago City Council, I think, won 7 new seats, something like that. 5? Okay, 5. Listen, it takes, you both need organization, but you also need leaders if you're going to actually make change. And people like me who are on the organization side, we need to acknowledge when people really put themselves forward, because it's a very hard thing to do. I mean, every elite force in Chicago was no doubt coming down on him like a ton of bricks. And these hedge fund guys, I mean, we've all seen these stories about the 158 families in America responsible for literally half the money in the presidential race. This is not a democracy. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be 1 person, 1 vote, not $1, 1 vote.
Coming back to criminal justice, let's talk about the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago. That's another situation where a police shooting of a young black man, the videotape was apparently suppressed for over a year during which that re-election campaign of the mayor took place.
The release of the Laquan McDonald video has shaken Chicago and the metropolitan area like nothing else in a long, long time. It's shown that we have significant problems with the police department in how it relates to community, that there's been abuse, extensive abuse by police officers, that there's a culture of cover-up, a code of silence in the department, and that other officials have not held police officers accountable to bring them to justice in filing charges. And the state's attorney's been implicated in that. She's up for re-election this year, and she could very possibly lose her seat because of the events in Chicago, because people are so upset that this could happen in the 21st century. People thought we had moved forward as a city, as a region, and that there was greater fairness in the criminal justice system. All of that has been blown off, and now it's raw for everyone to see. So it also ushers in, while there are many challenges, a new opportunity to improve the police department in terms of its composition, the practices and the culture and the training of officers, the police accountability mechanisms, the police board, the independent, so-called independent review authority, to restructure it, to just build a new culture about policing and relationship of trust and confidence with the community. We may also have a new state's attorney, which will be important. And now there's a greater understanding about why African Americans and Latinos and poor people in general wind up in our county jail, which is in my county district, by the way, and that we are not being smart about criminal justice. So the window is open for some significant criminal justice reform and transformative reform like never before, but it also opens the door to the other question is, why did politics get so corrupt, and why did certain groups dominate the politics? And it does come back to there's too much money in politics, and it separates ordinary people from their leaders.
So to go back to this question of how do you change power, I mean, let's talk aspirational now, and sort of if you had a vision of the next political system.
For one, removing the big money out of politics, leveling the playing field. Why? So that ordinary people can run for office and represent their community. The likelihood that they will stay closer to the people that elect them, that they will be loyal to them, that they will fight for their issues, that they will enter into good deals from the annual budget to development in their neighborhoods, to investment in their neighborhoods, a fair share across the board, an equity agenda. That's what can happen. When you remove the money, that will change. People who have taken big money will be shamed into denying it, declining that big money. That is a very important part of a culture. Two, I think that Chicago is on the verge of a generational leadership change, and that many of the activists who were called to action by the injustice in the Laquan McDonald video, in the subsequent videos that have been released and become a part of the conversation in Chicagoland, are the future leaders that our communities desperately need. It will be very, very refreshing. So what's occurred in New York is coming to Chicago, spreading throughout the land, and I think that the Bernie Sanders campaign will also attract many of the future citizen activist legislators that we need at all levels of government.
And on the economic side, if you were mayor, what would you do to address some of these questions of inequality? I know that you've supported the great worker-owned co-op of New Era Windows that we've reported on this program. What else?
A priority in the neighborhoods. I would not sit on almost $500 million in federal funds designated for public housing. That's what's happened over the past 4 years, when there are over 30,000 people on waiting lists trying to find an affordable place to live in Chicago. So being neighborhood centric is important. Not that we'll ignore the central business district, it will continue to thrive. So much has been invested in it. Good transit is important. Moving people from the areas that have the highest unemployment rate to where the job centers are, another important investment while we work on neighborhood development, finding new clean manufacturing that can occur in the areas that once provided the old manufacturing jobs, in the area of technology, green technology, urban farming, all potential for labor-intensive employment for the neighborhoods that need it the most. That was the fundamental thrust of our campaign, and just greater democracy and decision-making at the local level.
Even cities have enormous purchasing power. They have big bank deposits that they can use. So you can incentivize purchasing. You can use purchasing to help co-ops. You can put money in community credit unions as opposed to putting that, in the big banks. There's all sorts, the city can have a housing code that requires retrofits, which creates, energy retrofits, creates a huge amount of work, which, has been talked about in Chicago and elsewhere. So there's lots of ways to use the levers of power of government to advance the interests of ordinary people, the non-wealthy. It takes good ideas, it takes courageous leaders, but it is not beyond what's possible. And when you do that, you just create an appetite for more. And so it's, we hope, a virtuous cycle.
So each of you, just speak for a second and I'll let you go to the viewer at home who's saying, I just can't bear these elections. It's such a drag watching all those ads on my TV. I'm just going to wait until 2017 rolls around.
This year is a potentially turning point in American history. If people understand that the system doesn't work for the many across the land, this is the year to make a statement with respect to who will be the next president. Participating is so essential. I'm really excited about the people that have been, the young people that have been drawn into this campaign. They've got to stay involved if there is going to be systems change in our politics. This could be a year. You can't afford to sit it out, because the most fundamental changes that we've experienced easily in the last 50 years could happen this year, but only if people who have stood away from voting and from politics decide that they're going to become the drivers.
The movement for Black Lives has opened a door that I have a feeling African Americans knew already what was behind the door. Someone like me maybe didn't know quite so much. And there's no shutting that door. And I think the leaders, and there are lots of leaders, if I use that broadly, understand that the battle against mass incarceration, for example, requires new and different district attorneys and prosecutors around America. It requires different priorities in state legislation and state legislative bodies about how we're going to tax and how we're going to spend and what we're going to spend on in schools and healthcare, in after-school programs, and so on and so forth. So, I get why people are frustrated. It seems like the system is rigged. It is rigged to a large degree, but it is not without its weak points, and that's where we have to rush through.
Well, so Harold Washington ran twice. You got a larger percentage of the vote this time around than he did, I think, in his first run. Do you want to declare here that you'll run for mayor?
It's a bit early. It has not been a full year since my run, but I have to tell you, I am very, very excited, and I think that the eyes of people in Chicago and Chicagoland have been opened. As a result, I think our region will continue to progress forward. I think people today understand that you cannot have a world-class city or a metropolitan area where part of it is suffering and part of it is thriving. There has to be collaboration. We need to use our natural resources efficiently and fairly. So I think there's a great opportunity to really take a step forward in terms of equity and sustainability for the environment and improve people's lives.
And if people want to bring the Working Families Party to where they live, can they do that?
They should go on our website and let us know who they are and where they are. We are starting to spread our wings. We're active in 10 states now. There's organizing committees in a couple more, and we're looking to grow still further. But it sounds to me like we all need to get on the bus in 3 years and go hit the doors for Chuy Garcia.
Working families are in Chicago. They're very welcome and they're thriving, and they're going to improve things for families there.
It's a mutual admiration society.
Already built right here. Thank you both.
Thank you.
White men comprise 31% of the American population and just 23% of Democratic voters. Still, they control nearly 90% of what happens in Democratic politics. How smart is that? Our next guest thinks not very. Steve Phillips is a civil rights lawyer, co-founder of PowerPack.org, and the author of Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority, just out from the New Press. Here's Phillips. What do you say to people who say, there's too much money in politics? What are you talking about?
Well, the money is what it is. My issue is how it's actually being spent. So the Democrats spent $2.7 billion in the 2012 election. And my concern is that they're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars because they don't understand how the electorate has changed, and they continue to chase the shrinking sector of the electorate which is the more conservative white swing voter, instead of investing large amounts of money in the growing communities of color, which are the cornerstones of a new American majority.
What kind of money are we talking about?
Well, 46% of the Democratic voters are people of color, and so close to half of the money they spend. So if they're going to spend close to $3 billion, close to half of that really should be invested in hiring consultants who understand these communities, hiring staff in the communities to go door to door, really partnering up with community organizations and churches. Those types of things are much more effective than 30-second TV ads trying to change the minds of conservative voters.
And how much do those TV ads cost on average?
Well, that's the multi-millions that get spent. Roughly 80% of all spending is on these television ads, and then a total chunk of that also goes to the fees for the consultants who put the ads together. So there's an article in the New York Times recently referring to it as a consultant's racket, and it really does need to be changed and broken, and most importantly, because it's not a winning strategy. If it ever was, it certainly is not anymore.
What is your vision of how it could be done differently?
So if you look at the 2012 election, Obama got 200,000 more black voters in Ohio, and they hired 650 full-time people to do door-to-door organizing, doing phone calls, reaching out to their neighbors. They had 130 field offices across the state. So it's building large capacity and infrastructure in the communities that are growing, hiring from those communities, and developing partnerships with organizations who have the respect and the credibility in those communities.
So why should people read your book?
Well, first of all, this election is such a critical period. There's so much hanging in the balance, and that with the Obama's election, it represented the culmination of the civil rights movement, both in terms of the population changes, but also in terms of the issues set. So in terms of health care and equality and women's equality and marriage equality and immigration reform, all of that is at stake, and the conservatives and Republicans want to roll it back. And my concern is that too many Democrats and progressives don't understand what's going on, and they think Obama was a one-off, and so we have to go back to chasing the conservative swing voters. And so the imperative is to get people to understand both what's at stake, but also what the right strategy is to win. So when we have increased turnout in 2008 and 2012, we've won. When we have distanced ourselves from a strong progressive social justice agenda and chased after the more conservative swing voters, we've lost. 2010, 2014, people were uninspired and they stayed home. Which way are we going to go in this post-Obama era, the first post-Obama election? That's the imperative. That's why I wrote this book.
Steve Phillips's new book, Brown is the New White, is available at your local independent bookseller. There's more information at our website. Well, here we are in my least favorite phase of the election season, the part where pundits and politicians pile on en masse to pull public aspirations back. Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, calls it the "we shouldn't even try" attitude common among establishment Democrats. Ralph Nader calls them the hereditary Democratic opinion shapers who tell their audiences to line up behind experience and electability as if it's that or certain death. This is designed to panic and mute their followers, says Nader, and all too often it does just that. Think about it. What brings people into the political process? I think of what Progressive Caucus co-chair Keith Ellison said when I asked him if he liked campaigning. "I love it," he responded. "It's the time in the year when we talk to our neighbors about their lives and why we care." His eyes lit up. Sure enough, a successful candidate is one like Ellison, the guy who rallies people to believe that the future is about more than fear and that change is possible in their lives, in their families, in their country, and they can be part of it. Bernie Sanders has rallied a lot of people just that way, most especially young voters. He's received 80+% of the youth vote in several states. What happens in elections is candidates talk to people, eyes bright, promises on their lips. They persuade people they can be powerful, they matter, they're needed. But what we tend to mean is vote. And after voting, people are expected to cede all their political power back to their political representatives. The panic and mute sets in early in the U.S. system, right after the primaries. No wonder the electorate shrinks smaller and smaller. Will Sanders' supporters shrink back? What if they don't? What if they channeled their energy into building progressive power at the local level? What if they refused to give in to panic and mute? Tell me what you think. Write to me, Laura@lauraflanders.com.